Hey there, welcome to Help Solve the Case. We are talking today again about, I believe it's day 5 in the Lindsay Clancy trial. This is the mom who is accused of murdering her children and what it sounds like faking a suicide attempt and throwing herself out the window in a fake thing, claiming psychosis, claiming mental illness that was not there, that she actually had this intent to do this all along, and we're going to see where that lands. So thank you for being here. We had a lot of witnesses today. I'm going to go through my notes. It's very interesting, and I would love your take on this. Today's session, the last day we skipped the last day because it was a site visit, didn't really have any video of that, not too much information from that. To my understanding, they went to the restaurant, they went to the CVS, and they went to the scene of the house. We had a lot of doctors today. We had Dr. Kelly McDonough, and they talked about, again, the Commonwealth, the prosecution is really focusing on the seriousness of the issue. And again, we're not looking at it necessarily one side or the other, but how the Commonwealth is going to prove the intentional, because the defense is talking about whatever was going on mentally, the prescriptions, the bipolar, the psychosis, that Lindsay was not right in the head for a specific period of time. She was just directed to do this. She was hearing voices, what they call command hallucinations. And the prosecution is trying to negate that and prove that was not true. And I would like to know, based on what I've told you about, if you've seen any of it. I think this is a huge hurdle, and I'm not sure, and we'll go through what I heard today. I'm not really sure that they're necessarily doing a good job of it. I would have expected to see more psychological treatment parameters and things of that nature than what I'm seeing from the prosecution. Sometimes you can have attorneys. I talk about the Netflix show that we're going to take a look at who puts on the best show. And sometimes the attorneys can irritate, and in their presentation and the way that they're presenting the information can irritate the jury. And at this point, I will say, if I was a juror, I'm not on one side or the other, but I am getting irritated by the way that the prosecutor has chosen to present the case. For lack of a better word, harping on a few things instead of making what I would consider a more foundational contrast between crazy all the time and crazy at one particular moment. And I don't mean to use crazy in a particular way, like mental illness that's persistent but not affecting her ability to know right from wrong. I guess that's the way putting it there. Or that it was only one moment in time, or that it was so pervasive that it ruled out what happened. I don't even know if I'm explaining that properly, but I just don't feel that the state, I'm not sure why they're doing what they're doing. I think there could have been a better way. And again, not one right, one wrong, whatever. We've got children that are deceased, horrible situation. What caused it? I personally would like to know more from the experts than speculation about different things. For instance, talking about these superficial is the word that the Commonwealth, the prosecution keeps using, and like I said, I'm trying to be unbiased here, but I really am having a negative reaction to the presentation and how they're presenting their case. We'll see if it changes because just like the jury, we have to review the entire case. But I'm not feeling that I have enough, and I believe that they're probably going to rest soon. There's not enough information to highlight to me this difference between the superficial intention, right? That she was just a normal person with intention, that she had criminal intent, and this other superficial stuff that the state keeps talking about. And I would like to know what you think. Do you think that the Commonwealth is doing a good job? Do you think the defense is doing a good job? Obviously, we haven't always seen the defenses on cross. I got some issues with him too. They are picking little particular itty bitty. I don't want to say itty bitty is not the right word, but they're picking particular buzzwords and focus, I think, instead of showing a broader connection to make this more realistic, whichever way they go with this. So let me go to my notes. Dr. Kelly Madonna talked about trauma, that it was a level 1 trauma, which is more serious, that there was neurological deficits with a spinal injury. And again, here's this word, quote, superficial, bilaterally, words that were not acute, that were not in the subcutaneous tissue, that no artery or vein was cut. And there's a sentence here from the doctor that, quote, I assume they are acute, saying they're going to, kind of like we talk about, a death is always a homicide until proven otherwise, that as a trauma doctor, they're going to make an assumption that they are acute. But doing the triage and doing the trauma triage, the main concern was a head injury and a spinal injury. And there was no neurosurgeon on duty, which will come into play later. And the neurosurgeon is more on the brain. They talk about sending the blood to the lab, and that there was a thoracic spinal injury. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later too. Then Lindsay got transferred to tertiary care, which would be more specialized care. They did talk about the fact that she was hypothermic and that her temperature was 82.1, and she had to be put in this thing they were calling a bear hug, apparently something that warms you up. And that this low temperature could have been caused by something metabolically or exposure. The Commonwealth brought out that there was no blood on the head, and there appeared to be, excuse me, no head injury on the records, and that they never observed bleeding on the wrist. Now, the defense attorney comes up and was asking about, was Lindsay nonverbal, that the eyes were open, that she was completely unresponsive, is usually eyes closed, but her eyes were open, but she was nonverbal. She did sometimes have a response to pain stimulus. They talked about, which is the response to light, which could indicate a head injury. There was a lot of, I don't recall, I don't know today. They said that Lindsay was pretty quickly intubated, and so it was difficult to make a complete and formal assessment, and that the intubation was difficult, and they would give meds, right? So the defense is asking, would you give meds for the intubation process? And again, just pointing out that medications can dull your response, can interact with your brain, being confused and stuff like that. The doctor said she didn't do the intubation. I believe that was a lady. I could be wrong. The temperature was 82 degrees. Then the doctor was asked, did you review your notes prior to coming in? And the doctor said, I don't have a photographic memory. They were also talking about cerebral CSF. They kept responding to cerebral spinal fluid. And was there leakage of cerebral spinal fluid from the nose? They said there was none seen. Now, it's important here, I think, to highlight this because the Commonwealth seems to talk about this generalized faking. It was all for show and all this stuff. Meanwhile, the defense is trying to say, look, this was pretty serious. She had a pretty serious intent and she really messed herself up. And here's why. And so it would make sense that the Commonwealth is going to focus on she really wasn't hurt very badly. And the defense is going to show that she was. Obviously, we can see that she is paralyzed. And here's another question to you. When you're evaluating this, do you think whether or not superficial cuts on your wrist have any bearing to literally throwing yourself out the window or jumping out the window or whatever happened and breaking your back or your neck or your spine? And I'm just asking this from the standpoint of I've dealt with a number of people on the street and in my personal life where you have what they call hesitation wounds, and that people intend to do something and then they can't do it. It's painful. For whatever reason, they have second thoughts. They can't. It's painful. And so we see a number of cuts. I haven't heard any of the doctors, we're going to get to some psychiatrists. I haven't heard any of the doctors talk about that. That's something that I was trained in. Hesitation wounds versus really going for it, for lack of a better word. That sounds terrible, but it shows sometimes intent and that it can be very painful and people, for whatever reason, can't go through with it. And here it seems that we had multiple modalities. We have cutting, we have pills, and we have falling. I'm just saying, how much is too much? How much is too much to be fake? What does it take to not be faking? And again, I'm just asking the questions because we have to look at it from the defense side and the prosecution side. How bad, if you're faking it, how bad do you have to fake it to fake them out, right? Or what really needs to happen here? Like I said, I think the Commonwealth is focused on these particular areas of the faking it and the superficial injuries, as opposed to really getting into the headset and the mindset and the behaviors of, is it possible that this could have happened, the psychosis or whatever it was? And if not, why not? Instead of these other injuries. That's just my thought. So they're talking about this cerebral spinal fluid because it seems to me, which we'll hear about the defense, that it seems like Lindsay could have actually had a way more serious injury than, that's just my take on it. And he's eliciting testimony. I don't know if there's going to be another lawsuit or whatever's going on. We've heard that there's lawsuits. Having sworn testimony in court is really good if you have another lawsuit waiting in the wings, because then you can impeach a witness and you're drawing out your information that you need. But to me, that's my cop suspicious nature. I've also worked in civil malpractice cases and things like that, that I'm thinking like he's kind of setting them up. He's kind of setting them up because he's talking about this cerebral spinal fluid. Was there any leaking? I guess that indicates a potential head injury. Did they see any in the nose? They talk about how quick the results came back. The CT scan would be able to show damage to the neck. They talked about the thoracic spine injury, and I thought this was interesting. I've always heard these numbers, but I never really knew what they meant. So if it's the top part of your neck, it's a cervical, the C numbers. If it's thoracic, it's below your neck. It's the T1, T2. And then lower is your lumbar. And so when you hear those numbers, L1, L4, T2, C3, whatever that is, you can tell where it is. I've always heard people say those numbers, and with the letters, I never knew where it was. They talk about the thoracic level. That's what this doctor thought about. And the defense was asking, were you aware that the thyroid was crushed? Were you aware that the cervical vertebrae were crushed? And were you concerned with the breathing? And the doctor said, we were looking at a thoracic injury. So that's from this area. And the defense talked about a complete transection of T5 and T6 and on your back. So let me do it I don't know how to do it. Best do it this way. On your back, your vertebrae go up. And they said there was a complete transection. So it completely, apparently the spine was severed or whatever, and they completely separated. And that was the demonstration that we got. The bones were moved apart, and there was significant edema in the chest with swelling or fluid. And again, probably not noticed. So what does that mean? The defense is talking about all these x-rays and tests that were taken. They talked about the body temperature being lower than normal at 82 and how it affects the body, that it can hurt the organs and things like that, and that it could come from metabolic derangement, meaning your body's metabolism is out of whack, which could lead to or be because your cells are not working right. He asked about the wrist. They're talking about this volar aspect and that the wounds were, quote, not deep. They asked about the cardiac arrest. Were they aware that she had cardiac arrest at Boston and that she had to have a massive transfusion? And the doctor said they couldn't comment on that. And like I said, I have my notes here. Sorry, I've got something in my eye. There's a lot of, I don't recall. And I made a note here, lawsuit, because I felt the defense was hunting for information. Then the Commonwealth came back on and gave the doctor her notes, talking about how pupils react to, one will react differently, or one will react and one will not react. If there's head injury, they said there was nothing obvious, that Lindsay did move her arms to painful stimuli. There was no cerebral spinal fluid noted. And they basically said, so the Commonwealth was trying to rehabilitate this doctor. That's a word that you use in these cases, rehabilitate the witness, by having the doctor say, look, we were not treating. We were looking for spinal injuries, were to assess, stabilize, and get them where they need to go. So it's not a treating hospital. It's what we got. What do we have got going on? ER trauma. What do we got going on? And where do we need to send them? Again, talking about superficial wounds, no active bleeding, no muscle tissue or injury to the tendons was seen. And again, like I said, the Commonwealth is focused on these wrist wounds. Then we had Rose Stoffers, who is a sergeant with the state police, talking about she was assisting with some of the crime scene processing, but the scientists are there to really take more active role in doing the testing biologically and things like that. She went to the South Shore Hospital to document the defendant's injuries and do some swabs. They found the defendant covered in blankets and heating devices, and she still had the neck brace on her neck. We saw a picture. They took her arms out from under the blanket, and we were told she needed assistance because the defendant, Lindsay, was fighting back. They got the nurses to assist. The Commonwealth was asking about the temperature in the room and said that it was very hot. Sergeant Stoffer said that there was a red-brown stain on the hand, and there was gauze on the wrist, and they took it off to take photos. They started talking about the defense came on and was talking they started talking about case numbers and chain of custody, and the defense stepped up and said, we don't have any issue with that. They were talking about Trooper Rabbit, and that Trooper Rabbit, yes, Rabbit, took the photo of the bag of meds, that this was apparently turned in later by Patrick. We heard about that. That was the one that they showed, that the state showed, the Commonwealth showed, with all the empties. And those were the discontinued, according to Patrick, the discontinued medication. The defense was asking about the search warrant for the house and what was taken, where the bag of medication was. And the detective said that, or the sergeant said that Trooper Rabbit just gave the bag at his office. And then they took a recess, so they were arguing about something. Then we had Rochelle Amade, who was a nurse, that it was her responsibility to stay with the patient. The patient can't be left alone because she was a, quote, suicide risk. This was very kind of disturbing to hear, things that I guess we weren't aware of, that the defendant coded. So she was brought in that night from the house, and around 3:30 the next morning, which for us, when we go to sleep is the same night, but it's actually formally another day, that the defendant coded that they had to increase the blood pressure medication, that she had to have chest tubes put in, and that she needed massive transfusion protocol. Going back to, that's why I said the other doctor in the trauma was like, right, that nothing was wrong. No head injury, no spinal fluid, none of this, but yet she coded and she needed massive transfusions. The Commonwealth was asking if there were police officers outside the room. There were soft restraints, and that she had no emotion and was flat. But she did say that sleep was an ongoing issue, and we had heard that previous to the incident. Now, if we look at it from the state's point, the Commonwealth is going to try to say, look, she's fine. This is her normal thing. She had the intent, all these issues. She had all these issues, whatever. But the defense is going to say, look, she fell into this psychosis, this postpartum psychosis, bipolar, whatever, the culmination of all these medications and all this stuff led up to lack of sleep and all this stuff, which is just, what do they call it? A perfect storm of psychosis, or whatever they're going to call it. We don't know what they're going to call it because we haven't heard their people. But this culmination in this mental incapacitation that caused this. All right. So on February 2nd, according to this nurse, the defendant asked to reach out to their lawyer. There was an objection. They came back and clarified that this had not been asked before, that she had not asked for a lawyer before, and that this was the first time that there was any conversation specifically about the case, and it was not a conversation that had been had previously, that no one outside law enforcement was allowed in the room, and that Lindsay was not allowed to have visitors per police. And this nurse was the evening nurse, and Megan Collins was the other nurse, was the day nurse. The defense came on and was asking about the lawyer, clarifying that the defendant was admitted in January 24th about 0300. That's when this nurse started to see her. They talked about an MRI. They talked about how on January 28th, so 4 days later, the defendant was finally able to communicate via a whiteboard for the first time. The defendant asked for an attorney, and that shortly after she came over to this hospital, she had a cardiac arrest. And he was referencing some notes in the hospital records talking about SICU. And this is, I mean, it sounds really horrible. There were 2 rounds of CPR. She had bilateral chest tubes put into her lungs. She was down about, or no, let me take that back. They removed 100 to 300 cc's of blood from the chest tubes. And then they had the massive transfusion protocol. And there were 30 cc's of clear fluid came out of her nose, which the defendant, the defense attorney, is talking about comparing that to the trauma nurse that said, we were just concerned about the thoracic. And he was asking about head trauma and dilated pupils and cerebral spinal fluid and all this stuff that was going on. That and talking about, I don't know how much 100 to 300 cc's of blood is, but, and this is the medical word for it because the defense attorney clarified it, massive transfusion protocol. Now, what am I thinking? Internal injuries, bleeding internally. I'm also thinking, and I don't know, this would be a question for defense and prosecution alike, how many cc's of blood are there in the body normally? Because if they took 100 to 300 cc's of blood from the chest tubes, how much would that leave left versus, and not to be gross, how much blood was on the floor of the room? And I know this is horrible to think about, but we're talking crime scene, talking cop, talking prosecution and defense. Because just because it wasn't bleeding outside for the defense theory of coldness, freezing, hypothermia, that the blood stops, the heart stops pumping, the heart slows down, and you need the heart to pump to get that blood out. If the hypothermia is true and that's the reason for the lack of the blood flow, how much was in the room? We saw in some pictures a good pool of blood. So I would want to know, how much did she bleed in the room? They took this internal 300 cc's out. How many transfusions did they have to give her? Like, adding that up, what was the cause of the blood loss? And how much blood did she lose? Ergo, how much did she potentially bleed out on the snow and in the house? Just a question, just a crime scene, putting it all together question. Because the Commonwealth keeps hitting on superficial. And this could be, I'm not a medical professional. I don't know if you can weigh all the blood and how that goes. But if they can show that all that blood bled out in the house and everything is the right amount, then the state could have a problem about superficial. Do you see that? That's why the hitting on these words, semantics, you have to be very careful. So she had acute blood loss and anemia, acute blood loss. So where did it go? Where did it go? Again, superficial, using that word superficial. If it's superficial, where did that go? The doctor said, we don't know what caused it. How much is in the room? How much is in the room? On the floor and all over. I don't know. We were spared a lot of those photos. She needed multiple transfusions. Multiple, not one, multiple. So, was the blood loss at the house, in the chest, or both? Talking about a cerebral fracture C1, T5, T6 transection was severed. Talking about neurogenic shock, rib fractures, thyroidal edema. And the doctor was asked about, on page 72 of the medical records, it says, quote, postpartum psychosis. So Who wrote that? Did somebody make a diagnosis of that? Where did that come from? So would that have been in effect at the time she came into the hospital? Ergo, the altered mental state at that moment or moments over the days, over the weeks, was it caused by postpartum? Was it caused by this medicine? See where we're going with this? That would have removed the criminal intent needed to satisfy the state. Then, of course, they had a sidebar. Then they start talking about that there had been discussion about postpartum psychosis. They talk about in January 25th, they will involve the social workers and the legal teams. They talked about a significant amount of fluid from the nose, which I don't know if it's not snot. Was it tested? Was it cerebral spinal fluid and she really had a head injury? I don't know. Again, why is this important? You have to ask this question. Why is everybody harping on what they're harping on? They talked about an RUE. Oh, the right, was it right? RUE. Shoot. Left under, man, I had written it down. Sorry. An RUE was a we're talking about the wrist, 3.5 centimeters deep laceration on the volar aspect of the wrist. 3.5 centimeters. That sounds pretty deep. It says he read it, 3.5 centimeter deep laceration. Is that length or is that deep? Because that sounds pretty deep. And the doctor would not say deep laceration. The doctor kept saying, I didn't measure it. I didn't measure it. I didn't measure it. They're looking at the defense is like, it says here, explain to me 3.5 centimeter deep laceration on the volar aspect of the wrist. And the doctor kept saying, I didn't measure it. I didn't measure it. I can't say. I didn't measure it. I didn't measure it. Then they have the left side, 2 centimeter deep laceration volar aspect. Again, same thing. That, I don't know. How deep has to be too deep? Core temperature, 82. The bear hugger they talked about. And the fact that the temperature was still 82 degrees at the subsequent hospital after being in South Shore with the bear hugger, her temperature was still pretty low. Again, playing into the defense side that Lindsay had hypothermia from being out in the snow for unknown how long, and that's why there was no bleeding. On January 28th, she could talk. On February 2nd, she asked about the lawyer. And defense asked, were you not aware that her mother and father had hired an attorney? And she said, I wasn't aware of that, because the state's trying to make it like all she's asking about is a lawyer. Then the Commonwealth came on redirect and was talking about only times that the defendant was with the nurse, that the blood transfusion came after. They talked about the R to the MRI to the trauma surgery. And there was discussion about postpartum mood symptoms, not psychosis. And there was a little back and forth about what was in the notes and what wasn't in the notes, but that was not clarified. Again, I would like to hear more detail about what means what and what was actually in the notes. They talk about, this is the Commonwealth, that Lindsay was then fully evaluated by a psychiatric team, and there was inherent uncertainty in the diagnosis. And I don't know which side that's helpful for. They were talking about not immediately changing the bandages, but they were not seeping and there was no treatment. And then the defense came up and said, so there was inherent uncertainty as to the diagnosis, right? So he's hitting on that. That means We don't know what it is. So therefore, they could not make a determination that she was not in psychosis at the time. Uncertainty. And so then the defense was asking, when was she formally evaluated? Then we saw Megan Collins, who was the day nurse, that when she came in the very first day, that Lindsay was not stable overnight. She went in for a CT. She was showing neck injuries, and that they were focused on the neck injuries. And the Commonwealth was talking about more significant spinal injuries, that the spinal injuries were more significant. The nurse was asking about information, and the nurse said, look, I don't diagnose, I just look at the notes from the doctor. She talked about Lindsay having increased confusion and agitation, so she had to be restrained. The nurse was asked about ICU delirium and stated that it did decrease her sleep, or that the ICU delirium finally did decrease, that it is a recognized thing, that she was having sleep issues. The psych consult was present, and they needed to determine the capacity, and that the nurse was present because she advocates for the patient. The defendant was looking to change her healthcare proxy, and that during this visit, there was a visit that the social worker was present, the nurse was present, and Lindsay's lawyer was present. The nurse said that she was aware that no one besides the medical staff was supposed to come in. The defense got up and was talking about the nurse's concern to protect patients, talking about changing the documents from the husband as the medical power of attorney, or the medical proxy, let's just use that word, from the husband to the parents. The nurse was asked about a DNR, which is a do not resuscitate, and the nurse said that she thought Lindsay was a full code. The nurse did say that she was aware that Lindsay wanted a DNR. Or no, the defense attorney said, were you aware that Lindsay wanted a do not resuscitate? And the nurse said she was not privy to that, and that it wasn't in the medical records, or not sure if it was in the medical records. We then had Dr. Shaw, who's a psychologist or psychiatrist. I only wrote psych, so I'm not sure if it's a psych or psychiatrist. Probably a psychiatrist. They talked about different things, the number of reasons, what was going on with Lindsay, that she's seen a lot of patients with a suicide attempt. That's a common reason. That they were evaluating Lindsay about making decisions, that she needed to voice a choice. She needed to understand the situation. She needed to understand the apparent risk and benefits, and she had to be able to rationalize the decision. That the fact that she did have a traumatic brain injury can factor in, and that they wanted her to make decisions that would be consistent over time. Originally, after the surgery, she was delirious. She was having visual hallucinations, and it could be an issue because of the oxygen or the anesthesia, but it was resolved by the next day. They talked about a Glasgow scale of a number 10 when she came in, and they talked about a CAT scan, and the fact that you can have a normal CAT scan and still have a brain injury. I believe, going back to that original treatment at the trauma center, the mental status was okay, her mood was okay, she had an organized thought process, no hallucinations, no homicidal or suicidal thoughts. Her insight or judgment was fair, she was calm and cooperative, and that at that moment, no, very succinct, at that moment, no visual, that's what was going on at that time, and that she did have visual hallucinations overnight. On February 19th, she was evaluated again to prepare her to go to Spalding, which was a different medical facility. They did ongoing safety evaluation, a medical evaluation. And Lindsay denied suicidal or homicidal intent. She had no audio or visual hallucinations. Her mood was okay. And she had no confusion or disorientation, and she was future oriented. That's one thing when we look at deaths that could be ruled a suicide. Were they looking forward to things? Did they have things planned? Is everything in line with what they had been expressing? So the fact that we could potentially, in this case, again, not a medical or psychiatric professional, we could look at the fact that, as opposed, was this a long-term medical issue or mental issue that was going on or not, according to the Commonwealth, or the fact that she was planning and was doing things, that it was a snap thing because she did have this future orientation, right? That's something to look at. On February 21st, she was feeling down over the paralysis and what had transpired. She talked about what had been done. She did not have hallucinations and she didn't have paranoid ideations. She had a low mood about her physical situation and her legal status. But other than that, things appeared to be fine. She was written up as no major depressive episode, which could go on more towards, is that more prosecution or defense, that it was a one-time thing, that it wasn't an ongoing pervasive thing. Because let me tell you, if you have a major depressive thing all the time and now you're going to jail for life and you're paralyzed, would you feel that would be the time that it would show up? Again, I don't know. This is where I would expect to see more psychiatric and medical professionals really talking about these things. And I don't feel they're bringing it out. I think they're just fighting words instead of putting data behind it, my opinion. The last visit was on February 22nd. Lindsay was hopeful about Spalding and future oriented. The defense attorney got up and said, was she an honest patient? There was an objection, which was overruled. Yes, she's an honest patient. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't deny she denied she had bad thoughts, but she didn't exaggerate her condition for legal reasons, right? So she wasn't what the defense could say, play acting, right? We see sometimes that people can fake stuff to get certain type of treatment or certain type of things. And so the defense is eliciting from the doctor here that she wasn't exaggerating and that she had close contact with her for a month. The defense revealed, or had her revealed, that they knew she had postpartum was one of the issues, and that the doctor was familiar with postpartum psychosis. That when people have postpartum psychosis, they can communicate, they can plan, and they can talk, and they can act on plans, that they're not necessarily drooling or stumbling. And that was the defense's word. They talked about how the defendant was very ill, but she was cooperative. They talked about bipolar being was the doctor familiar with bipolar? Yes, it was a familiar diagnosis, that it's a mood disorder and it's distinct. Depression and manic or hypermanic behavior, something like racing thoughts, out of control behavior, maybe psychosis. They could be hypomanic to a lesser degree, talking too quickly. And there was an example of overcleaning the garage, working out too much, not sleeping. And the doctor said yes. Now, if you remember, if you watched it, and I think I mentioned it in the very first one, they talked about cleaning the garage. And was Patrick in there with her cleaning the garage? And I think he said something that they were sorting things to keep, to throw out, or donate. I'd have to go back because I didn't pay attention to, but I thought they're going to bring this up somehow because that's the strangest thing to say. So what they're saying here is that cleaning out the garage and working out, if you're obsessively cleaning out the garage, like throwing everything out of the garage, or excessively working out and you haven't slept for days, that could be hypomania. They talked about the drugs that the doctor believed that Lindsay was on. They talked about the state police. They talked about SSRIs and the difference between what antidepressants did and didn't do. The defense clarified, should a bipolar person be on antidepressants? And the doctor answered and said they can be, but they need protection from another medication. And again, we didn't really get that clarified. They talked about depressed people typically lack serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter. It helps regulate mood. They said when you're depressed, you don't have enough serotonin, and that an SSRI helps serotonin be more available, and that an SSAI does the opposite. They discussed diazepam, Valium, Butrin, hydroxine. I'm probably not going to get these right. I was trying to write so quickly. Clonopine, benzodiazepam, lamonazine, Prozac, Reneron, and there were a couple antidepressants in here. I think at least 3. And so what the defense just solicited, that if Lindsay is bipolar, and I'm not sure that we have that diagnosis yet, but if she's bipolar, they shouldn't be giving her that. We heard that, I believe, in the opening or the first couple witnesses, or it would need whatever this protection thing was going on. Talked about Seroquel, antipsychotic, trazodone, amitriptyline, was the older antidepressant, Ambien, Zopidone, Celexa. It was a lot. The defense asked the doctor, do some of these medications have a black box warning or a suicide warning? The doctor said yes, especially around when you start it, because it could increase risk. Now, looking to the defense side, they kept changing her medication. She kept starting these medications. Now, I don't know whether you consider, because some of them, she took them 7 days, 3 days, whatever, according to the Commonwealth. We don't know really what she was taking when. That would be for her to say, or maybe we have her medicine log. But that's a lot of starting. And if these suckers are dangerous for starting, who's making their point here? What is the real truth of this? Do we know? The Commonwealth came back on and said, were you aware that she wasn't taking all these drugs at the same time? The doctor said, I wasn't aware. The doctor said, we typically just look through the prescription history. We talk about other providers. And no matter, in any case, we were using a different set of medication. And I thought this was interesting. I'd like to know your thoughts, because we haven't heard anything about them unable to stabilize her. We haven't seen anything. She hasn't fallen asleep at the table. We haven't heard anything about current medical conditions. Obviously, she's in jail or a psychiatric custody facility, and we haven't heard anything like that. So how is it that these people were able to get her stabilized and on medication that she can participate in her trial, which is important? How come they could get her stabilized on, and this is the key wording here, different medication? So does that help the defense's case that different medications made a difference, i.e. a beneficial difference, whereas these other medications had horrible? Just asking, what do you think? They talked about mania being such like exercising and cleaning. If they're manic, it's in a disorganized way. They usually don't finish things. They start and stop a bunch of things. They talked about the keep, store, and sell, that if somebody was cleaning out their garage and they were organizing, being the key word there, organizing things to keep, store, or sell, it wouldn't be mania. Again, that's the Commonwealth. Going back to the original thing when I believe it was Patrick was asked what they were doing in the garage. So the defense came up and was talking about, hey, look, just because somebody exercises every day and if they have a messy garage, would that mean that they had mania? They said, no, of course not. But then the defense said, what about if somebody said they went 48 hours with no sleep and they were telling you that their brain was broken, that they can't think, that they were having suicidal ideations, that they were having homicidal ideations. Those are ideas that would that change it? And the doctor was like, yeah, yeah, okay. They were talking about the medications, right? So the defense says, oh, the Commonwealth says it was just 3 medications. And the defense asked the doctor, you were not aware that of these medications and these new meds and things were discontinued. The defense asked about the fact that Lindsay asked for a do not resuscitate and that she continued to chat with the mental health providers and in an attempt to stabilize. We then had Dr. Bishwash, who's a forensic psychiatrist, and they met on the 26th from 2 to 3 p.m. Lindsay was intubated. It was difficult for her to answer. She was exhausted and anxious. They asked her how she was feeling. She said her mood was horrified. Her affect was anxious, and the doctor did consider that she was intubated, which is very painful and very causes anxiety. The evaluation was done through writing. Lindsay asked about, do I have an attorney? That they felt she wasn't sure what was happening. They didn't know what was happening. They said she had questions. Is my body broken? And are my legs straight? She asked if she could have visitors and asked where her family was. They talked about what the reason for this visit was, and it was diagnostic to determine her status before surgery. This is before apparently she went in to have some of her spine fused or something with the spinal injury. They said she seemed to understand the questions, though. She needed frequent breaks. The Commonwealth was talking about this made sense given the situation. She was fine. She wasn't saying things like, is there a unicorn in the corner? They talked about psychosis and what are the signs. And the doctor was like, that really depends. There's a whole spectrum. Everybody's different. The only thing that the doctor really could put into play was just generalizing about there could be negative symptoms, which are things that people have internally. And then there's positive, which are outward focus, which she said it's not what you think it is, like paranoia or hearing voices, that those are things that are happening externally and the negatives are happening internally. They said that the doctor said that they look different for each and every person. So there's no one thing or one way that you can apply it across every person. They talked about the fact that Lindsay was not responding to internal stimuli, that people, when they hear voices, when they're active, they appear to interact with them. So they would be talking to them or they would be looking at people across the room. And the doctor was asked, did you see any of this? And the doctor said, not in that snapshot. There was an objection. Then they were talking about a professional assessment of responses. Was Lindsay confused or oriented so she could sleep? Was she suicidal? What was going on? And then they were talking about that this was an assessment before surgical intervention, and that they felt that she could decide that she was okay to decide about having that surgery at the time. Then the defense came and was talking about psychosis again, that have you dealt with it? A fair amount, that people hear voices. The defense asked about this command hallucination. That's yes, it's hearing voices and delusions. Were there any indications of psychosis while in the hospital? And the doctor said, I only saw her the day after, and they only saw her one time, probably for 20 to 30 minutes. So this is the trying to limit the ability of what this doctor had to make some sort of a diagnosis when you've only seen the patient for 20 to 30 minutes before a major surgery, like a day and a half after all this trauma happened. They talked about, is psychosis something that continues or stops, right? So would it be continual all the time, or would it come on and come off? The doctor said, depends on the patient, the age, whatever. Again, no, nothing is the same. They can have moments of clarity. Some have clarity, some don't. It's case specific. Again, going back to, she called, she did this, she ordered food. All the things are those moments of clarity. How big is the psychosis? How long does the psychosis last? When does it come on? Does it snap in? Does it snap? Do you hear the voices all the time? We don't know. Again, this is where I would like more documentation backing up what's going on. The doctor was asked, was she aware of the prior medical and psychiatric history? And they said, no, only the medical record portion that was available in the hospital. She was asked about postpartum psychosis. And she was asked about, did she know that Lindsay was being treated for that? And she was asked, did she speak to anybody first before evaluating Lindsay? And she said no. She said she was aware of postpartum anxiety in the record. She was aware of insomnia. She was not aware that Lindsay had had episodes of not sleeping for 48 hours. They asked about comments. She was asked about prior comments about her brain being broken. She said she didn't see that. She was asked about command hallucinations. She didn't see that. Did she know about her suicidal ideations? She doesn't recall that. Does she know about the homicidal ideations? Not in the records. If somebody was having homicidal or suicidal ideations, was having command hallucinations, and said that their brain was broken, could they be in psychosis, and would the doctor be concerned? She said yes. If she knew about the suicidal ideations, she would be concerned. She did not know about the homicidal ideation. She said, I knew there was an event. And he said, you mean 3 children died. So he lashed out a little bit at that one. They talked about hypomania, that hypomania can be a gradual increase towards mania, and that there could be mixed depression. When she evaluated her, she saw nothing at that moment. She was not reading anything as a treating physician, so she was only evaluating prior to the surgery. The defense said, what is your purpose at the hospital? Are you treating her or not treating her? Because she seemed to disassociate herself from all these things that one might think that she should know. And she said, look, I was treating her, but I just needed to evaluate her before she was going into surgery. We talked about continuing to follow and assess her. Did she know the type of surgery? She said spine. Did you know that her spine exploded? Did you know that this was all actively happening, that she was in pain, that she was on meds? Did you know that she coded the day before? No. Did you know that she almost died before you saw her? Did you know there was a profusion of blood in tubes? And she was saying that she thought it was after, and he was really trying to catch her in that. They talked about, did this continue for the month? Apparently that she was in the hospital, and the doctor said, look, I just saw her one time for 20 minutes. They were asking her how many cops were outside the room, inside the room. I don't know. How many were outside? I don't know. I knew she was in custody. That's what she said. Did you know she couldn't have visitors? Did you know that she had soft restraints? The doctor did not talk to the police, and that ended her involvement. She was like, okay. The Commonwealth came back and said, what records did you look at? She said, I looked at the records in Epic. They were at the hospital. She did not do a deep dive into the psychiatric history. She said that she usually gets, quote, some records when she meets with the patient. Then there was some talk, there was an objection, and the defense said that basically they were sick of the state trying to accentuate that the defendant asked for a lawyer. They talked about how she was exhausted. She was asking about, was she broken? Are her legs straight? Do I have a lawyer? The Commonwealth was trying to say the only things that she asked about is, am I broken? Do I have my legs straight? And do I have a lawyer? And the defense came back and said, look, in reality, she wasn't focused on much of anything, was she? And the doctor said no. Then we had the Commonwealth put on Robert Flynn from the Duxbury Police talking about going through the house, that they were doing a protective sweep, that he was asked about the screens. The screen appeared to be pushed up. Somebody was doing a crime scene, a crime log. They put crime scene tape up, and then the troopers showed up. There was a search warrant. They went back out when the search warrant was done. He didn't collect any evidence. The state police, he was asked to go back in and close the window. There was no damage to the window or the window screen. That he had to move the bed because the blood was in the way. Again, how much blood? Did she move the bed? Did he move the bed? Again, there wasn't a question about what we saw in the photo. Did he move it? What was it like? Again, detail, attention to detail. So I don't know whether she moved the bed that way, he moved the bed, or whatever. He did have to remove some medical equipment during the search warrant that was left by the firefighters. And then they talked about conducting some follow-up interviews and that the state police were the primary. The defense had no questions. We then had Santos with the Mass State Police. They talked about books being taken in the kitchen. The defense stipulated to some of this. They talked about what was collected was discharge papers from the McLean Hospital, a list of meds, lorazepam, melatonin, and trazodone with the discharge instructions. There were instructions and resources for therapy and community service. There was a notebook with a postpartum sheet and medical dosage sheet in there. There was a book, Good Moms Have Scary Thoughts. We heard that in the beginning. There was a postpartum anxiety workbook, which the Commonwealth made sure to say was blank. There was a notebook for Callahan and Patrick Clancy, which included some of Lindsay's writing and messages for the nanny. They were asked about searching the kitchen for prescriptions, talking about searching in the office. 2 laptops and an external hard drive were taken. The detective was asked about looking in the nightstand, and he said he didn't look in the nightstand, that somebody had already searched the area. He was mainly going for the closet, and that he found nothing of note in the bedroom. He did think that the notebooks were pertinent, so he took those. He was asked about the crushed up pills and the lemonade, whether he knew about that. Did he know about the prescriptions that were found? They did find some medication in the kitchen. The defense then asked who found the medication in the kitchen. The officer said it was the locals or the state. They were seized, and they were seized because they were, quote, relevant and mattered, end quote. In the books too, you know where he's going with that. Then why didn't you take this for the bedroom? But we'll get to that. They talked about the diary. Why was it seized? He said he's a captain now, but he was a lieutenant at the time. He was not in charge of the scene. It was the detective lieutenant who was. He was asked about who searched the bedroom. He said it's probably in the report. I don't know. Do you have your report? No. How many officers searched the bedroom? Probably 5. And the defense is obviously trying to show what a poo-poo show it was that they didn't find this stuff. He asked about what would happen. We would log it all in if it was seized, like the laptop computers, the cell phone on the bed. They took the laptops and the cell phone on the bed because it, quote, made sense because they're electronic media and that's important. And so then the defense attorney obviously is talked about the Apple Watch. Did that make sense? What did this medication and all this stuff make sense? And he's hammering him and he said, I didn't search that drawer, sir. And so the defense says, so you don't know whether it was searched or not, right? Then we have Corey Mello with the state police. He used to work at the time for the DA's office, the state detective's office. He was not the case officer. His role was to assist. When the search warrant was executed, they searched the home. He located the phone on the bed, so it puts him in the bedroom. Talk about the laptop, the exercise bands, and the computer were turned over to the evidence officer. Talks about items being brought back for further examination. I don't understand that. They talked about it was chaotic at the house, I think taking them back to the police station. And he was asked to review books and journals. Talks about one journal, obsessed with his sleep and nap schedule. Feel like I did it wrong. Now I have horrible insomnia. Feel guilty about not hitting milestones. I'm completely overwhelmed. Feel like I'm drowning. They continued with just some statements. And then the defense came up and was talking about these entries. And it was very clarifying. Again, I would like more, dare I say, scientific than emotional responses here. But it talks about, he said about her dealing with her children, that she had horrible PTSD. I want to die, talking about when the baby was crying. Sleep training was just about killing her. He didn't recall who Lainey was, even though he read the notebooks. Talking about the defendant driving around in the car trying to get naps. Talking about doing it too young, referring to sleep training. She's talking about, I don't have any appetite. I need help. I want to be well. I need to get a good night's sleep. I have crazy brain fog. I can't carry it out. I feel I can't help him. I'm worried about functioning. I'm worried about withdrawal from the drugs. I feel horribly guilty about my marriage. Talking about birth control, the lack of a conjugal relationship, that she was spending too much money, costing the family too much money. The sick babies are miserable. She feels sleep training is abusive. She said the crying is so stressful. She's sad about not being able to breastfeed, and she needs to do something for her mental health. She was desperate, and she said, my mind never shuts off. And then they talk about, starting in November, that these affirmations started. I'm calm. I will remain calm today. I will sleep tonight. Today will be a good day. Gratitude. It was really sad to hear these writings. And then the detective was again asked, did he search the bedroom? He was actually shown the drawer, and he said, I don't recall. So again, long day, lots of notes, a lot of back and forth, some repetitive. What do you think? Who gives us, at these type of cases, what behavior, or who gives us, oh, what's going on my lips? Right? Who gives us the definitive answer about what was going on? Criminal intent, ongoing psychiatric issues. Who do you feel would be the best person to tell us that? I don't know. I just don't feel there's enough substance here. I feel it's a tit for tat situation, personal animosity, but that's a good way to describe it. Personal animosity between the attorneys instead of getting to the facts of the case and presenting an unbiased, unemotional delivery. That's what I want to say. Let me know what you think. I know it's been a long day. We'll see you on the next one.